Before we really get into the whole TCP UDP discussion, though, let me talk a little bit about reliable versus best effort. So, in the one hand, we have TCP. Now, TCP is connection-oriented and reliable. Now, just because something is connection-oriented doesn't necessarily mean that it's reliable. For instance, we're going to later talk about a protocol in the ICND Part 2 part of the course. We're going to talk about a protocol called frame relay. Now, frame relay operates at layer 2, as does ATM, which is very similar in the same respect here. Both ATM and frame relay operate in a connection-oriented fashion. We have a permanent virtual circuit, or a PVC, that's created from one part of the network to the next carrier piece of the network. But that permanent virtual circuit is a connection that's built between two devices and maintained. But, coincidentally, that connection's built, but it's not reliable. In the case of TCP, we're going to build a connection from one point to another. That's part of the process for TCP. There's another process in TCP that actually makes it reliable. There's a sequencing and acknowledgement section within the TCP IP header, which we'll see in the next slide, that controls how the TCP messages are going to be reliably sent back and forth. Okay, it's not the next slide, but in a couple slides later. All right, so the function of TCP is, again, to carry things that need to be reliable on our network. You wouldn't want to transport a database across your network and have it drop a couple packets here or there, because when you go to look at the database after it's been copied from one server to another, it's going to be corrupt. So we need a protocol that's going to maintain a connection as well as maintain reliability for the transport of that data. It's not necessarily the data has to arrive in an extremely fast, timely manner. We're more concerned that the data arrives in a reliable fashion so we can use it once it's there, once it gets there. So let's compare this to the best effort protocol of UDP. Now, UDP is connectionless and non-reliable. Not to say we shouldn't trust it for sending our data back and forth. The reason why it's not reliable is, well, let me explain connectionless first before we get to not reliable. The reason why it's connectionless is we're not establishing a connection from one point to another point. We're simply sending the data out and hoping it gets there. The standpoint of being not reliable, you'd think that, well, why would I ever send data across a network? And if I've got a choice of sending it reliable or unreliable, why would I ever choose to send it unreliably? And the simple answer is speed. The time it takes to generate a connection and the time it takes to make sure the data is carried reliably isn't certainly something you'd want to do for protocols like voice over IP or video conferencing. In those particular cases, when I have a specific latency window that I'm trying to maintain, I mentioned the 150 millisecond latency window for voice over IP. If you're trying to maintain that latency window, if I were to transport and we're talking on the phone, and we've got data traversing the network, if there's something occurring in the network, crashion particles, if you will, come in and destroy the packet in transit, the time it takes to discover that the packet is missing, plus the retransmission process, is certainly going to be well beyond that 150 millisecond window to replay it for data that's no longer useful. It was a time delivery data message that if it wasn't sent in a particular timely manner, the data isn't necessary anymore. So we simply skip it and go on. You get a little pop in your ear or some kind of missed syllable in the conversation, but the overall conversation should at least be intelligible. Now it depends on who you're talking to, whether it's an intelligent conversation, but at least it should be intelligible in some manner or fashion. So the idea of sending things in a reliable fashion when we need to make sure the data is there would be for TCP. If we want to make sure the data gets there, but we don't necessarily care if it does or not because it's a time delivery or speed issue, UDP is our best solution.